Massimo Pigliucci, as always, it is wonderful to see you. How are you?
I'm good. How about you, my friend?
I am doing very well. And as we near the Christmas break, and all professors feel giddier and giddier with every week that passes.
I think that goes for our students as well. I don't think it's just the professors.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Um, so we're going to try and sneak one more of these in before we hit the break and everything gets crazy and we have all these family commitments and stuff.
Sounds good.
And we're going to talk, Massimo, today about liberal education.
How appropriate.
Before we start, let's do our introductions. So why don't you go ahead first, Massimo?
I'm Massimo Pigliucci, the KD Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York.
And I am Daniel Kaufman. I'm a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University. You might be able to see a part of my dog behind my shoulder, the rear part.
Wait a minute. I have a dog too.
Do you really?
No, not really. But
Oh, okay.
so this is Plato. Plato is my ideal dog. It doesn't bark. It doesn't poop. It doesn't do anything. It's just there.
Wow.
I know, right?
Now, see, if I could have just convinced my daughter and wife of that, then I would have been a happier man. But
Oh,
I
well.
I lost that battle. Um, okay, so we're going to talk about liberal education today, and the conversation, at least initially, is inspired by a piece that I wrote and posted on my web magazine, the electric Agora, um, in which I criticize some very common rationales that are given for why we require liberal education at the university
Right.
for people getting bachelor's degrees. And I guess I was a little bit surprised that I got a lot of very angry responses. And it even spilled over onto your blog. People were angry at me on your blog, on your web magazine, your Plato's Footnote, and was wondered whether I had turned into some curmudgeon, or whether I was having a midlife crisis. And so I feel a little need that I need to.
Yeah, you don't strike me as either a curmudgeon or anybody going through a midlife crisis. That's interesting, the response, because I would have actually expected most people to agree with you and say, "Yeah, the hell with liberal arts education,
Yeah.
useless, etc., etc." But
Yeah. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just very briefly bullet what the main points I made were, because you said that you disagreed with quite a bit of it, if not all of it, and so
right,
that'll then give an opportunity for you to explain what you think is sort of wrong with my arguments, and then we can more generally talk about the value of liberal education and where its place should be and all of that.
sounds like
Uh,
a plan.
okay, so this essay was actually developed out of a keynote speech that I gave, that I was invited to give at an educational association. It did not go over well there either, and and
That's giving you a clue.
and um, so here's where I'm coming from. If you're not at one of the top universities or one of the elite liberal arts colleges, the liberal arts are largely relegated to the general education curriculum. So I'm at a very typical state university, not an R1, not anything fancy, the most common thing in the world, the kind of place where probably most Americans go to college. And in a population of 20,000 students, there are about 30 to 40 philosophy majors.
Right.
And that's pretty much what you're going to get. I mean, we try mightily to sort of increase our majors, but in my view, there's a natural ceiling, given the demographics of the people we serve and the types of people we serve.
Right.
So what happens is the humanities then and the liberal arts are left to the general education curriculum. Almost as if sort of we've made our stand at the general education curriculum. So we'll say, well, okay, I understand not that many of you want to major and stuff, but we still really need to have the liberal arts and the humanities because they're crucial to the general education curriculum. And the argument that we make as to why they're crucial to the general education curriculum is that we argue that they provide fundamental skills. And those skills typically break down into some version of critical thinking, by which is meant a sort of practical reason, capacity for practical reason. And then the other is vaguely articulated along the lines of something like moral character. The idea that somehow by studying these areas, if we're then going to go into business or into nursing or into any profession, that we're more likely to be ethical in what we do, if by virtue of having studied these subjects.
Right.
And so my criticism of this sort of operates at several levels. At one level, I recognize why we retreated to the general education curriculum, but I'm not happy about it. In other words, this strikes me as already defensive, right?
Yeah.
The other is that I don't think that these reasons are very good reasons. And that's sort of what made up the bulk of the essay that I wrote. And of course, there'll be a link to it so people can read it and see what I'm talking about. So on this subject of whether or not the liberal arts and humanities are necessary to provide these basic skills, and by the way, these skills are deemed as essential to being successful, not just in our professional lives, but also successful as citizens. We're told that if we want to have a good participatory democracy, then our citizens have to be educated in this material.
Right.
And I guess I find both of these arguments relatively unpersuasive, and primarily it's because of the way in which I think these sorts of skills are actually acquired. And I don't think they're primarily acquired through classroom learning. And also because of the kind of country we are. I'm not sure that we're the kind of participatory liberal democracy for which these ideas were originally promoted as being essential. And so, with respect to the first point, the ability to reason well, in the sense of practical reasoning, strikes me as much less a product of classroom and book learning than a product of experience. Let's put it this way. I know students who have gone through the entire regimen of logic courses that we offer, and their practical reason stinks.
Right.
And I know waitresses that I used to work with when I was in the restaurant business who've never set a foot in college, whose practical reasoning is sharp as a knife. Their judgments are great. They make great calls, right, when in various circumstances that demand it. And so I guess, to employ sort of language that we've used before, I view practical reason as more a matter of knowing how than a matter of knowing that. And so the sort of thing that one can learn in a classroom when one is taught logical fallacies or taught deduction or rules of inference or taught various things, I think has a very limited efficacy in terms of actually making a person into a good practical reasoner. And beyond simply the argument, I can simply point to a lot of people who've had precisely that sort of education who are terrible practical reasoners. And I can point to people who've had no such education who are very good practical reasoners, which suggests that practical reasoning is a skill that's primarily acquired in a different sort of way. With respect to the moral argument, I would say something very similar. That is that moral virtue is not primarily the result of intellectual training, of education of the sort that one gets in a university. It too is a matter primarily, and this I agree with Aristotle, of sort of, practice. And there too one can, easily point to the fact that there seems to me to be no correlation between the people who have been college educated and thus received liberal education of the sort we're talking about, and the set of people who are morally virtuous or civically virtuous. And so that's another thing that I just don't really think is very persuasive. I don't know if you want to break these up and maybe do the critique in pieces, or else it's going to be me talking for too long.
Yeah, let's go. That's right. So let's go.
So yes,
let's go a little bit by little. So the first observation you made was that there is a small number of philosophy majors in your program. That's I think pretty typical. I mean, we have at City College, we also have, I think, something like 50, give or take, majors out of a student population of, I think, about 15,000 or something like that, right? And that's fairly typical. There are exceptions. There are some public universities even where the philosophy programs are actually doing surprisingly well. But the thing is, surprisingly. So
yeah, like at Michigan. I went to Michigan. Now, Michigan has a top 10 program.
Right.
So they're almost in part like Princeton or Yale, or in terms of.
So there are exceptions.
Yeah.
However, I think that even there, so just looking at that data, I think actually this is data point to be put into perspective. For instance, I just learned recently, because we're having, as you might imagine, as usual, budget problems, at City College, CUNY, and all that sort of stuff. So one of the interesting statistics that the Dean of Humanities and Arts brought up is that there are, and he did not mean this as a criticism of philosophy, he just meant it as a very weird thing. There are something like 6 or 7 times more arts majors than philosophy majors at City College.
You mean fine arts, Massimo?
Yeah.
Fine arts? Yeah.
So it's like, okay, so I'm thinking, so if people don't go into philosophy because they don't think there is a career there, why the hell are they going into the fine arts, where it's arguably even less likely that you're going to have a career? And I think the answer there, quite frankly, has nothing to do with the value of philosophy versus fine arts or anything like that. It's got to do with the public perception that philosophy is the quintessential, useless field of endeavor, and then you're better off even trying to be a musician or a painter than trying to be a philosopher. So some of these statistics do have to do, I think, with specific situations within specific fields of the humanities. But I do think that you're right in general that at public universities, the humanities, broadly speaking, are not doing as well, obviously, as the sciences or as sort of technical fields. So let's
the STEM disciplines.
That's right, the STEM disciplines. Yeah. Right. And so let's take that as a given, right? Okay. But the thing is, then the question is this something that we want to encourage? I mean, is something that we actually want to foster or even make made worse or better, depending on how you look at it, or is it actually a problem? I mean, one could read your arguments and say, well, it is the way it is, and it should be that way because of all the reasons you started listing. And those are the ones that's where I actually have a little bit more of a problem in terms of sort of the specific arguments. I don't disagree, in other words, with what it is, the situation that it is now. It is true that most of the humanities are sustained essentially through general education curricula. What I disagree is that why that is and how it should be different. So, for one thing, you say that the kind of skills or the kind of general view of the world that is taught in the humanities it would be much better to be absorbed as a practice than as a sort of theoretical thing. That
the skills that we are claiming the students need to study liberal arts humanities in order to acquire, I don't think are mostly acquired through classroom learning.
Right.
Yes.
Now, but in order to do that, first of all, you have to draw some fairly heavy distinction between knowledge that and knowledge how, as you pointed out just a minute ago.
Yeah.
And as you know, we talked about Ryle actually in one of our recent video discussions. Ryle himself doesn't draw that distinction that sharply. And in fact, even Aristotle, I would say, doesn't. Certainly not all the Hellenistic, the ancient Greek and Romans did. There was certainly for the Stoics, another group that we talked about recently, there was a continued interaction between practice and theory. I mean, you definitely want to practice. The point was you don't achieve virtue, you don't become a virtuous person without practice. You don't change your character, you don't improve your character without practice. But you also have to know where the practice is going and how to do it, because otherwise you're going blind. You need some kind of guidance. You need some kind of sort of theoretical grounding. So that's one consideration. First, that there's no sharp distinction between knowledge that, and second, that actually even both ancient and modern sources do seem to indicate that virtue or character, however you want to put it, is actually developed through both. The two are not mutually exclusive. So if anything, I would say what that means is that we are deficient in the practice, that we should improve our curriculum or improve the experience of our students with practice, just like the sciences do, right? So you don't learn biology or physics just by doing theory. You also go into the lab. The lab component, when I was a practicing scientist, and still today, of course, most of my colleagues in the sciences are adamant about the fact that a scientific education, a STEM education, has to go through some level of practice. Otherwise, you don't really get what these people are talking about. But they will also very equally, very strongly defend the idea that yes, but you also need the theoretical understanding. So I'm not convinced that that's that different in the case of the humanities, although of course it does have the different flavor and different kind of implementation. I mean, we're not going to have laboratories in anything like the sense of science.
Maybe when we talk about what we see for the future, you might give some idea of what might be analogous for liberal arts humanities. Because I mean, one of the things I hope will come out of this is some ideas for suggestions that may lead to future essays on my part or whatever. And so maybe later we can talk about that.
I think that's a good idea. Now, but still on the general, on the sort of broad general idea. First of all, there is empirical evidence that studying the humanities in general and in fact in particular philosophy is helpful both in terms of practice, sort of practice not in the sense of virtue practice, but practice as in technical practice, as well as that it does in fact lead people to develop a better, improved understanding of the world in which they live and therefore how to navigate it. So from a practical perspective, for instance, when I was a department chair in the philosophy department at Lehman College, which is also part of CUNY, I had to really look at the data. I was, my dean was very evidence-driven, and I'm a scientist, so I'm fine with being evidence-driven. So I actually went and looked into data, and it turns out that there is data out there about this, and it's pretty clear. It is, although it is obviously always very difficult to disentangle causality from simple correlation, but it is still the case, very clearly, that, for instance, philosophy majors do very well at very practical tests, such as the LSAT, the GRE, and all that sort of stuff. They have very high levels of admissions into graduate school, law school, medical school, and so on and so forth. And one can argue that that's in part because people who are driven to study philosophy are the kind of thoughtful, dedicated people, et cetera, they eventually do well no matter what they do. There is an argument for that. But you can also make the argument that philosophy does teach portable skills, critical thinking, critical reading, so analysis of complex situations, and so on and so forth. These are portable skills. These are things that philosophy is not the only one to teach. They can be taught. Philosophers sometimes claim a little too much.
And we're not only talking about philosophy; we're talking about liberal arts and humanities in general. So
that's right. That's true. But let's not forget that philosophy is a fairly large, a good component of that.
Yes.
There is also evidence. In fact, I was talking to one of my colleagues in the humanities just very recently, and in fact, even in the social sciences. There's also evidence that, let's say, reading literature actually does help empathize with people that are different from you. It does help putting yourself into a perspective that it's different from your own. There are certain things, like, for instance, a colleague of mine gave a talk in one of my classes recently about how it is much better to study to understand sort of the colonialism, for instance, not just by looking at the data, not just like looking at the historical facts, essentially, of the thing, but also by reading diaries or novels written by people that actually have experienced colonialism firsthand, because that's the way in which you empathize, you open yourself to different perspectives. So there is a number of empirical there's empirical evidence that ranges from quantitative data to sort of more qualitative kind of assessment, that the humanities do what they claim to do. That is, expand people's perspectives and also give them technical skills that can be used in pursuing other fields. So if you put that together with this idea that knowledge then and knowledge now are not quite that sharply distinct, and with an acknowledgement that you are certainly right that the practice is important, I think you begin to build an interesting sort of counter argument. There are a couple of other things I want to mention, then we can sort of
Did you want to address the issue of moral virtue also, or do you want me to respond to this first? I do have a few things to say, not a lot. Yeah. Or do you want to do both? Go after both of my points first before I talk to you.
Let me finish a couple of things about moral virtue as well. So there, I think that your position, for instance, from the way I understand it, I think that a number of religious figures like priests, pastors, and rabbis would disagree that there is no need or that it doesn't make any difference to have sort of a theoretical understanding of certain issues, which is why you go to catechism, for instance. As a Catholic, that's what I did.
Mm-hmm.
Again, they would certainly immediately add that that's not enough. You need, that your religion, or in my case, your philosophy is something that you need to practice on an everyday basis. But again, it doesn't seem to be mutually exclusive with the theory. And finally, let me just mention one thing. So one of the people that I have been very influential early on in my own formation was Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky famously said that, in his opinion, the people of the Western countries, what we refer, perhaps as you say, optimistically, as sort of liberal democracies, they really need to take a serious course in what he called intellectual self-defense, precisely for the reasons you're talking about. That is, precisely because we do live in society where there is a large degree of manipulation, collusion between government and private sector, advertisements that bombard you all over the place, manipulations all right and left. Well, then I would think that Chomsky is right, that precisely because of that, you want to give people tools to react, to be aware. Let me give you an analogy, and then I'll stop for a minute, and we can get into a discussion. So, as you know, there's been a lot of research in recent years showing that human beings are prone to all sorts of cognitive fallacies, that we have all sorts of sort of bad ways of reasoning, that we rationalize things, and so on and so forth. Now, some cognitive scientists have therefore use that data to argue that, well, see, all of these talk about learning critical thinking and all, and being aware of fallacies and all that. It's just like it's not very useful because here, look what happens. Human beings actually are, in fact, engaging in fallacious reasoning all the time. But that strikes me as weird, and in fact, it's kind of opposite to what would be a reasonable conclusion. That would be like saying, we know that people gamble in an irrational way because they don't understand probability theory. Therefore, let's not teach probability theory. No, I would say, therefore, let's teach probability theory. In fact, let's increase the classes in probability theory. Let's make it mandatory so that people actually have at least an understanding or a warning about what they're going to do. The same goes for cognitive biases. I think the same goes for these broader and admittedly much more fuzzy category of what I would consider civic virtues. That is, being aware of it, reading about it, reading the theory, I think is a fundamental part of giving people the tools to resist and react to precisely that kind of society that you are, I think, effectively describing.
All right. So, and I will say that, with regard to the point you made about Chomsky, I did say in the essay, and we'll talk about this, that I could see somebody making an argument for a kind of almost countercultural role for liberal education. Yeah. But I then also said that I think it would then have to take a very different shape than it currently takes. A lot more Huxley and Orwell, and a lot less John Locke. But
I could go with that.
But let me go back to just a few things, and we don't have to go around on this too much. I'm very happy to just sort of let it sit with your arguments and my arguments, and sure. Let people. But just a few things. So first of all, with respect to the theoretical point, I don't think I ever said, and I certainly didn't mean to suggest, that there is no role for classroom learning and for the sort of knowledge that one acquires from classroom learning. Okay. Simply that the benefits of that from the standpoint of skill formation are mostly indirect and relatively minimal. And my evidence for the fact that they're relatively minimal is that, like I said, I know plenty of waitresses who are outstanding practical reasoners. They've not had a single day of logic education. And indeed, I know waitresses who are a hell of a lot better practical reasoners than my philosophy majors. Right. And so to argue that somehow this is necessary strikes me as way overselling it, right? I'm not saying it's not useful in any way, but what I'm saying is, to claim that it's necessary, then I would have to believe that, A, the college students are all going to be great practical reasoners, and B, that people who haven't had this education should be terrible practical reasoners, and neither is the case.
I
right?
hear you, but let's be careful here. So no, I wouldn't go as far as saying that theoretical knowledge is necessary for practical reasoning. Although I would argue that we live in a society that is increasingly complex, where the practical reasoning isn't as simple as, say, what was necessary, what was sufficient to navigate a society of 200 years ago or 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. I mean, we live in a society where there are drones and terrorist attacks and politicians that can use very advanced technologies to sway the audiences and so on and so forth. So with all due respect to your waiters, I do think that there is quite a bit of sort of in terms of technical knowledge, just awareness of things that are going on that most people might not be aware of, that needs to be brought in. But certainly, I didn't mean to suggest that there aren't plenty of people out there who are very good at practical knowledge without having theoretical basis, and vice versa. You're right. I know a lot of people who have a lot of theoretical knowledge and they don't know what the hell to do with it. But this is really an empirical question that needs to be debated on the basis of numbers, right? Because otherwise, if we don't go to actual numbers, actual studies, it begins to sound like my father, who died of cancer after smoking for a lifetime, and kept telling me until the very end that he knew somebody who smoked for 90 years and didn't get cancer. Well, sure, we can all cherry pick basically whatever examples are go our way. And what I'm saying is that now it'd be nice to have more research, because that's for sure. One of the things that we do need is more sociological research, more systematic research on the benefits, both practical and theoretical, of studying the humanities. But, once we go down that route, I would actually also like to have the same thing done for the STEM field, because quite frankly, on the basis of anecdotal evidence, I'm not so sure that people that study the STEM fields are that much better doing whatever it is that we expect of them, as citizens or as members of the workforce and so on and so forth. So, we seem to have slipped, now we not as in you and I, but as a society, we seem to have slipped into this assumption that, well, of course studying biology or chemistry or physics is important, even though a lot of what you study in biology, chemistry, or physics is essentially irrelevant to everyday life or even to work life. Right? I mean, I'm still not convinced that teaching college students, quantum mechanics, unless they do go on in a career in the physics, is any more relevant than teaching them, Shakespeare or Plato. In fact, I think it's less relevant than teaching them. So
but I mean, of course, we have to be careful, because we're slipping in between general education and what people major in. I mean, the thing about STEM is, look, the STEM people have to take all the same general education courses that everybody else does, and so the reason why STEM is so popular is because people are convinced that these are money earning areas, so that when people graduate college, they'll be able to get jobs. Right. The Gen Ed argument is an argument about sort of basic skill formation that then gets applied anywhere. And I guess what I'm saying is that I just think that the arguments that are made on behalf of the role that liberal education plays in inculcating those skills is wildly overstated. Now, you're right about the fact that this is at the end of the day an empirical question. The problem is that I don't really see how one could do an empirical investigation into this, for the following reason, and that is the fact that we have surveys data that shows that philosophy majors do well on the GRE, on the LSAT, or that philosophy majors do pretty well in the job market when they get into. That's not, in my view, evidence that learning philosophy makes you a good practical reasoner.
No, it is, of course not. It is evidence that learning philosophy it is at least partial evidence, because, as I said earlier, there is a really complicated issue of disentangling correlations and causation. But that is partial evidence that studying philosophy is actually practically useful in terms of career, which is one thing that most people still deny.
Yes.
And in terms of employment, for instance, it is simply not true that people that get degrees in humanities don't get good employment, good salaries, and so on and so forth.
That's right.
They just don't do it by becoming poets. right? So you study literature, let's say you're a literature major, English major. You don't become necessarily an English professor or a poet professional. You become something else because, I don't know, a journalist or, writer of some other kind, or you just use your skills, your reading and writing skills in other areas.
Yeah.
But that's true also for the other fields. I mean, sure, if you're talking about majoring in engineering, probably you're going to have to become an engineer, or if you're majoring in nursing, you're going to have to become a nurse.
Or accounting, you're going to be an accountant, or yeah.
But if you major in mathematics or in physics or in chemistry and biology, actually very few of those people become professional mathematicians, biologists, chemists, or physicists. Most of those people actually are going to go into more generic jobs where they, however, used sort of the kind of rigorous training that they got when major. So there is that. So I think it's relatively easy, or at least it's more approachable, to make the case that general education and even majoring in certain humanistic fields, it's actually much more useful than practically useful than people think. Now let's go back to the issue, however, of virtue. Right. So good question there about does the study of philosophy or literature or the humanities in general make a person, a better civic person, I would say, a better member of society? I am going to bet yes, but there is no data that I know about.
Really? You really think that?
Yes, I do, because on a basis of anecdotal evidence, on the basis of, so for instance, last night.
So the college-educated people have typically been better folk than the blue-collar people I would say in my case, my experience has been exactly the opposite of that.
Better. It's better. It's a dangerous word, of course, right? Because it's amenable to all sorts of definitions. No, I think they're more aware of what's going on. And so
I see.
So my students, for instance, typically when I teach a course in critical thinking, they're initially stunned by just how easy it is to manipulate opinions through the media, through one of the things that we do in my critical thinking course, for instance, is this game that I call Spot the Fallacy, where I present a number of news items covered by different channels, and we look at the same news items, and it's presented in very different ways, and I challenge my student to sort of make a comparison with that. And many of these people, many of these students who are smart, but they're just it's not like they're not deficient in anything in terms of sort of raw intelligence, but they just have never thought about it that way. And plenty of my teaching evaluations are of people who say, I'll never look again at news in the same way as I did before taking this course, right? Now, again, this is anecdotal evidence, or at least is only semi-quantitative, because these are actually evaluations that, over a number of years. But I do think they do make in part my case. There are also more obvious cases. These are also anecdotal, so forgive me for that. But last night we had, yesterday was Philosophy Day and International Philosophy Day, and last night at City College we had Peter Singer who gave a talk about effective altruism. And one of the things that he did is he presented a number of cases of people who were majoring in philosophy, in particular, who were studying philosophy, who at some point, because of their study of philosophy, became sort of aware of certain issues that they had not given much thought about in terms of social inequity, social injustice, and so on and so forth. And that led them to drastically change their career path, to drastically change their behavior in order to actually do something about it. So some of these people created charities, for instance, that are into they're useful to evaluate other charities, like charity evaluators kind of things, so that the people can actually look at quantitative data to make decisions that allows them to do the most good that they can with whatever resources they're willing to part with. Now, these are levels of theoretical thinking, I think, that it's not normally, I wouldn't say always, but it's not normally within reach of people who have not been exposed to certain kinds of ideas. Now, is it possible there are exceptions? Yeah, of course. And am I claiming that one can be a good person only or even mostly just because of theoretical education? Absolutely not. There's plenty of good people out there. right? But it's
Yeah, I
one.
mean, don't you come from a largely working family? You don't come from an academic family.
No, that's right. I was the first one going and the only one
Yeah.
going to college in my family.
And I bet you they're all as great people as you are. I mean,
Thanks for the compliment. Yeah, no, that's right. So you're absolutely right. So I'm trying to draw a distinction here between good people and good people who are better informed, right? So good people with tools. I mean, when going back to Chomsky's
right.
phrase about going through a course in intellectual self-defense, Chomsky wasn't saying that intellectual self-defense is going to make people better in terms of, as in good, more virtuous, but it's going to make them more aware. And
Yeah.
therefore, gives them tools to actually practice their virtue better than they would otherwise. Right.
But then that seems to me now we're almost getting at a similar point that we were at before, which seems to me now we're crossing over. We're not talking anymore about education for skills. We're talking about education that provides information.
Right.
Right. That provides that. Now, I would never deny that in order to be, part of being a good voter is to know enough about the issues that you even know what you're talking about, right? But that's not a skill, right? I mean, the skill is the ability to identify what's right or what's virtuous, right? The information that's required in order to be able to navigate, let's say, a particular political issue or social issue, is another matter. And so, no one is suggesting that, hey, we don't need to. People need to learn some history so that they know enough information that they can intelligibly understand what's going on today. Right. I certainly would be the last person to suggest that. But when we talk about justifying the liberal arts in the general education curriculum on the grounds that they produce these skills, right, these fundamental skills, the capacity for practical reason and the capacity for moral virtue, for civic virtue, I don't believe that the more informed person is a better identifier of what's right and what's wrong than the person who is less informed. He simply doesn't have the information, but he may be just as good, if not better, at identifying what the right or wrong thing is when he has the information.
Oh, sure. But, yeah. Well, yes, I can agree with that. But the point of general education is, in fact, in part to provide you with the information, and not only with the information, but with the tools to handle that information, right? Because you can, frankly, the problem that we have in modern society, contemporary society, thanks to the internet, it's not that we don't have enough information. It's that we don't have enough, a lot of people don't have the tools to actually filter that information and figure out, the bad stuff from the useful stuff. Or as my grandmother used to say, separate on something other than color, chocolate from shit. So it's like, so I'm saying that there is a interaction between knowledge that and knowledge how, if you will, or between factual information, the on the one hand, the tools to deal with that factual information on the other hand, right? For instance, let me go back to my example of the person who should learn something about probability theory in order to navigate, the world, right? So I could give somebody a lot of statistics about X, Z, or Y, but if they don't have a minimum of theory, of understanding of how statistics work, and in fact of how easily people can be manipulated based on statistics, that information not only is not going to do anything, it's actually going to harm them because they don't know how to deal with that information, right? Now, I want to go back, however, to the issue of virtue here, because there I think you are closer to the mark in my mind. That is, if by virtue you mean, sort of goodness of character kind of thing, right? Are you a good person? There, I'm much less sure that general education is going to provide you that, or is going to be that relevant. I think that a good person is shaped much earlier on. I think that a good character is, in part, of course, it's the result of your genes, but in part is the result of very early experiences, family experience, perhaps educational experiences, but at a very early stage, like, kindergarten and elementary school. That's not to say that people cannot change. And cannot, re-educate themselves, even morally re-educate themselves. I mean, one of the things that is very successful, for instance, apparently, is a number of programs for teaching philosophy, practical philosophy, to inmates, in prisons. And they do seem to have a significant effect. So it's not like adults are completely beyond reach, that sort of of change. But I would agree that character is shaped very early on, and that it's largely set by the time you hit college. But then again, I don't know too many people who have actually claimed that studying Shakespeare or reading Plato is actually going to make you a good person. I think that the claim usually is that it's going to make you a well-rounded person, a more a person with broad intellectual horizons, perhaps stimulating your curiosity, perhaps giving you a different perspective on that number of things, and therefore indirectly making you a better citizen. So a better participant to society, but not necessarily a better person. I mean, in that sense, your waitress is probably just as good as anybody else that comes out with a college degree, or for that matter, with a PhD degree.
Well, I mean, we certainly do advertise our. I mean, and at least with respect to our general education curriculum, and I suspect it's not that different from that many other places. We certainly do make a pretty strong suggestion that the studying of ethics and the incorporation of ethics into the curriculum at the general education level, when combined with the teaching of critical thinking, does produce more ethical. Is likely to produce more ethical citizens. I mean, we sell it on that ground.
Well, but so that's an interesting one. So that's a much more specific claim, right?
Yeah.
Now that one, it's kind of interesting. So let me think about this for a second. So first of all, there is actually empirical evidence showing that that's not the case for professional ethicists, right? There's this famous series of studies that came out in the last 2 or 3 years that show that moral philosophers are no more moral.
That's right.
In their actual behavior than their colleagues, not
right.
The average person, but their colleagues in a university. That was so that's interesting right there. Of course, there's a number of reasons why that may be. I suspect that the main reason is because having a PhD in moral philosophy has to do with very technical, very specific kind of scholarship, and not necessarily anything to do with practical philosophy.
Yeah.
Right. But at the level of undergraduate education, I am not sure. I mean, this is a question of data, of empirical evidence. But I'd be curious to see, because I actually do think that some of my students who, for the first time, let's say, are exposed to utilitarian arguments about certain very specific practical moral dilemmas. Again, when I teach that kind of, I don't teach ethics usually, but I do teach a general philosophy, introductory philosophy course that does have a component of ethics. And I've seen, with my own eyes, my students sort of all of a sudden literally getting out of their box and thinking in a different way. But once that they were actually exposed to given different tools, let's say, to think about moral dilemmas. I mean, I've seen discussions in class on very practical things like abortion or euthanasia or drone warfare and something like that studied out at a very raw level, at a very unsophisticated level, before I gave my students the tools. And then once I gave them the tools, the level of discourse was much, much higher. So I expect, and again, this is an empirical question, but I do expect those students then to go into the real world, and the next time that they're faced with that kind of dilemma or complex moral situation, they have tools, and so they're going to say to their friends or relatives or something, wait a minute, it's not quite that easy, because there's this and there's that, and you need to consider the complication of the issue. So does that make them better persons? Well, I think that just the ability to be more nuanced about ethical dilemmas does make you a better person, because it makes you more comfortable with uncertainty. It makes you less sure and less self-righteous about your decisions. So I think there is a possibility that that's going to work. Now, if anything, I would say that the problem is that we don't do enough of it, of the kind of stuff we're talking about. That is, I would like to see an ethics lab, for instance, or the equivalent of an ethics lab. I would like to see courses in philosophy to be actually, in part, applied philosophy.
Yeah.
Right? And so I would like to see, I mean, I'm going to try, for instance, something like that in about a year. next semester I'm going to be on sabbatical. But don't worry, we'll continue these discussions from Rome.
Oh, that'll be awesome.
Yeah.
You should do it from restaurants and show me all the food I'm not eating, right? It's
not a bad idea. But what my intention is when I come back to teach an experimental course on Stoicism, because as you know, that's one of the things I'm interested in. And what I'd like to do is to go through the ancient texts, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and then to actually have the students practice. So I'll have them write their own philosophical diaries and engage into sort of meditation and things like that. And then see at the end of the semester, I'll give them questionnaires right at the beginning of the semester, and at the end of the semester, the kind of questionnaires that the Modern Stoicism project uses at Exeter University to gauge people's responses to these things, and see if actually it did make a practical difference in the way they look at things and the way they act and the way they feel about certain issues. So I think that you're sort of ironically, you're right there that we're too focused on the theory, but I don't take the message to be therefore the theory is irrelevant or it's not, it shouldn't be pursued. I take the message to be that should be just in this, like the STEM fields do. It should be actually coupled with practice, which is something that we, by and large, don't do.
Yeah. Let me just say one more thing about the good citizen, and then let's move to the thing about liberal democracy. Yeah. So when you were talking there, and you were talking about how studying these things makes you more nuanced and more, the immediate thing I thought of was these Yale protesters.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you that I'm very skeptical of this last bit that you just gave me. My experience is that certainly taking these courses, so taking our course in environmental ethics or in global ethics or in feminist ethics or whatever, we offer all of these, certainly makes people more activist, right? It gets them to go out and man the barricades. Right. But I don't think that I would not characterize much of what's involved there as good citizenship. Indeed, the opposite. These people strike me in a lot of senses as a bunch of Stalinists. And in terms of the way that they're going about doing what they're doing, and what they're trying to accomplish, and I think the reason for that is because at the end of the day, a 20-year-old is a 20-year-old, and one of the things that characterizes that age is that we are very ideological, and so all that happens is you put one of these people in a global ethics class, and you just give them a bunch of ammunition to become an even worse ideologue than they would be otherwise. Right. And to go out and demand redress for microaggressions and demand that people be fired and go and throw vegetables at college deans and stuff, I just don't see what you're describing happening. I just see us providing them with more information, but their inherent disposition is a 20-year-old's disposition, right?
Well, yes, it is.
And the result is not always better. I'd almost rather they didn't know this stuff, right? Because then they wouldn't be out there screaming at people.
The result is not always better. And as nothing as dangerous as little knowledge, right? Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And I'm actually, I've written about this on my blog. I am disturbed as well by the kind of stuff that is being going on university campuses. Although, as you know, it's a really complicated thing because the grievances that these students have.
And the different cases are different. I think the stuff at Mizzou is much more legitimate than the stuff at Yale, right? The stuff at Mizzou, there really are racial problems at Mizzou.
Correct. So there are. It's complicated. Some of the grievances are legitimate. The way they're going about it, it's
totally.
In some cases, certainly in the case of the Yale students, in my mind. Now, by the way, that we're both going to get in a lot of trouble because of this particular bit of the conversation.
That's all right. I can tell you.
So I take your point, but at the same time, I do think that those episodes are also in particular are the result of a very specific climate that we live today in not in Western society in general, but in American society in particular. So those things are not happening in other Western countries, for one thing, and they did not happen in America until very recently, even though we did have liberal arts educations and we did have, the same kind of thing. In fact,
I understand what you're saying.
Right. Yeah. So I think that
you're saying this is really anomalous and very heavily contingent on a number of very specific developments that are happening now, and that we can't really draw any conclusion from it about how we're educating these people.
Right. I suspect that that is the reason. I don't want to dismiss it, because I do agree with you that that is in fact a problem, and that it does need to be addressed. But I do think it's a result of a very specific set of cultural circumstances, and I don't think we can blame it on general education or on humanistic education. I mean, because if you do that, then you have a hard time explaining how come this is not happening in a lot of the places where there is arguably more humanistic education than there is in the United States. Because let's not forget that the United States is actually an anomaly among Western countries. It is true generally across the world that STEM fields are, of course, dominant now in universities. That's true also in Europe. It's true in Australia, in New Zealand. It's true in Japan, which is not a Western country, of course, but it's a sort of Western kind country.
It's a Westernized country,
right.
Yes.
Or in South Korea, for instance, right? Or in India, for that matter. But it is also true that the United States actually has arguably the least amount of sort of that kind of humanistic education compared to, let's say, still places in England, in France, in Germany, in Italy. And yet I don't see those other places being plagued by that kind of So I think we need to make a distinction.
I think that's a fair point. So let's quickly just talk about this other element. And that is that one of the other points, the arguments that I made, is that to a large extent the liberal arts curriculum has become somewhat anachronistic, and that is that it belongs to largely a pre-industrial society. And here's the sort of idea I was getting at. The liberal arts curriculum goes back to the Studia Humanitatis of the Renaissance. Okay, right. And by the time it morphed into what I could identify as the liberal arts curriculum, we were at a time in which you were beginning to have emerging liberal democracies, but they were still heavily socially hierarchical in nature. In other words, the franchise was limited. Okay. And it was limited to aristocratic and upper class people,
right?
Who also were the same people who would receive higher education,
right?
And the idea was to inculcate them in a certain literature, in a certain set of manners and mores, and ideas that would allow them to, in a sense, serve not just as the ruling governing class, but as the determinants of the main culture, of the primary culture, and in those days, those were the free people. Those were the people who got to vote. Those are the people who, in a sense, were engaged in public governance.
That's right.
It was also a time in which commerce was relatively unsophisticated, and that is that it really was a marketplace in the sense that people came to the marketplace with their carefully thought through desires,
right.
And the businesses tried to respond to those and provide goods and services in response to them. Once industrialization happens, and once you move to a model where you have mass democracy, where the franchise is universal, you no longer have these sorts of ruling classes, where the culture is largely determined by a very small group of elites in places like Los Angeles and New York, by huge media concerns, and in which commerce and governance are now highly manipulative. And the manipulation is very sophisticated and is grounded in social science, right?
Yeah.
It seems to me that you're in a fundamentally different universe, and a lot of the material that we're teaching still presumes the earlier universe. In other words, it presumes that we are free, rational beings who engage both the polity and the economy, right, in this sort of rationalist, enlightened, self-interested sort of way, right, when in reality we are being subject to the manufacture of both desire and consent.
Correct.
Oftentimes unaware of it.
Correct.
And so that's not a reason to have no humanities education, but it is an argument against the kind of humanities education we're currently giving, which is still largely the old one. Right?
Yeah. No, I hear you, but my response would be perhaps predictably exactly the opposite.
Please go ahead.
I think that precisely because of the reasons you just pointed out, we need more and better humanistic education. It is true that we live in a very different kind of society from what it was, a century ago, or 2 centuries, certainly 500 years ago. It's a society that's more complex. where, as you were pointing out, there's lots more manipulation that's going on. There's a lot of more stuff that it's difficult to be aware of and track and so on and so forth. But it's also a kind of society where we have a lot of, I think, positive developments, such as a dramatically increased access to education, dramatically increased access to information. You know, everybody has a computer and has the internet. Yes, I know that the most frequent thing that people do on the internet is porn, but still.
Hey, what's wrong with the porn? No, don't like porn.
But, nonetheless, so you know, people can inform themselves. They have access to a range of sources of information. The world is really much more open in that, from that perspective. It's also a much more dangerous place. And I'm not talking just about, you know, terrorist attacks. I'm talking about government manipulation, corporate manipulation, which I actually think, frankly, are much more dangerous than terrorist attacks.
In the pervasive long-term sense, yes, I agree.
Long-term sense of
yes.
situation. But because of that, therefore, I actually do think that we need to give even better and more tools to people to navigate these more complex landscape. Now,
but do those come from the traditional look? I mean, if you read John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, right, what it tells you is that you are a rational, self-interested individual, right, who engages in the social contract by coming into a tacit agreement with your fellows.
Right.
And this is utter nonsense. This is not anything remotely like the world we live in. And if anything, it gives you a misimpression, right?
But we don't stop at Locke, right? I mean, so
no, of course not. I'm just seeing as a very prominent sort of thing that we study. Or Mill's On Liberty would be another sort of thing that we might read. When really what we need to be teaching them is propaganda analysis. Right? We need to be teaching them how to decode.
Well,
right?
Again, that's what I am teaching actually in my critical thinking courses, propaganda analysis, right?
Right. So you're doing it in a non-traditional way then, because typically
correct,
it's Venn diagrams and.
No, that's correct. So we do need to update our tools, but still, I do think that, for one thing, let's take your example of, you know, sort of Locke and Mill and so on. As you know, we go also all the way to Rawls and Null,
yes,
and, you know,
yes,
sort of modern, more sophisticated, more contemporary kind of thinkers. But I do think that there is still a value in the history of ideas. There is still a value in figuring out, well, you know, you're not going to understand where Rawls comes from unless you do in fact read you know, some of the predecessors. So there is something about the history of ideas.
Bless you.
Of ideas that it's important. But you're right. The curriculum needs to be updated, and it is updated. It is being updated to some extent. I mean, I mentioned my own example of you know, how I teach a critical thinking class, but the fact that we're bringing in even in philosophy, intro philosophy courses, we're bringing in a much broader variety of voices: contemporary philosophers, women philosophers, minority philosophers, and so on and so forth. These all give a much more nuanced and much more complex intellectual landscape than sort of the classics, yeah, as they used to be taught, you know, until a few years ago. So you're right; it does need. But again, I think I take your counsel to be in your analysis to point toward a need for expansion and updating. And so maybe you can, you know, retain a certain number of classic texts. I am still actually quite a believer in the importance of being aware of history, both history per se and cultural history and history of ideas. But you can cut down on that. So select the best of the best of the best, and, you know, read Mill, but you might not want to read Bentham, for instance. You just might want to mention it, and then instead give more space to a more recent, more updated, more nuanced perspective on things. Yeah. But I read your analysis as pointing toward more and better, not. Yeah.
I think this probably is where we disagree the least, because I did suggest that perhaps one could reconfigure the general education curriculum, at least the humanities portion, as almost in a sort of a countercultural vein. And it sounds to me like you agree with that and are trying to partially do that already yourself. Yeah. I do think it would entail some substantial reconceiving of the canon. Yeah. I think we would have a lot more of what I would call the philosophers of suspicion. Yes. The Nietzsches, the Marxes, the Foucaults, the ones who are really seeing the need for decoding.
Yeah.
As opposed to the classical liberals,
Agreed.
in which there's no need to decode at all because everything is transparent in their universe, right?
Agreed. But that's from what I understand, something like that is happening. For instance, in English department and literature department. So I was on a search committee recently in the English department at City College because they were hiring somebody in a position that had to do with the connection between literature and science. And since my background is in science, then they figured I might be able to provide, good feedback on that hire. And so I got to know colleagues in the English department and a little bit, talking about a little bit with them. I was there for a few days at their major conference. And so talking about what they're teaching and how they're teaching and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that is exactly what they're doing. I mean, they're reading much less in the way of class. They're not excluding them. They still read Shakespeare for but they're going to they're cutting down on the standard classics, and they are in fact introducing a lot of modern literature that comes out with very different perspectives. They teach science fiction as thought experiments. They teach colonial novels written from the point of view of the colonized people, and and so on and so forth. So that is happening. That kind of appetite is happening. It may be that philosophy departments are perhaps slower in doing
because I think we're more conservative in general.
That's fair. I think that may be the case. But I think that we're going in that direction. Now, that said, there is one point that I think you are absolutely right. I think it's near the end of your essay, and it is when you suggest that a value, you say the actual value, I would put it a value or an important value of the humanities is for their own sake, as the kind of thing that one should engage and practice because that's what you want to do, because it enriches your life, period, without any particular practical application, either in terms of practical virtue or in terms of technical skills or anything like that, right? I do think that's a very important thing to insist on. I do think, and as you know, at this point, unfortunately, that is a minority opinion, and it is a countercultural opinion. But these things, I'm optimistic, perhaps, but I think that these things are these kind of pendulum swings back and forth, over periods of decades. I think you're right there. I think that we have gone into a society again, especially the American society, much more so than any other Western or Westernized society, has gone into the point where doing things for their own sake, or just because they're pleasurable, just because they give you a transcendental experience, or just because they make you feel like a human being as opposed to just an animal who goes around, doing what it needs to be done in order to survive and reproduce. Those are important. Those are crucial. And I think that people should be exposed to those not only in college, but before college, right? I mean, I do think that that's one reason why, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, we have a lot more majors in the arts, in the fine arts, at City College than in philosophy, because people do have that need. People do want to engage with poetry, with music, with literature for their own sake. If they can make a career out of it, great, but they want to do it for their own sake, right? Yeah. And there is a sense in which there's some kind of a contradiction between the modern academy and the outside world, because modern academy is becoming more and more, in the United States especially, it's becoming more and more sort of corporatized. It's becoming adopting the corporate model of practical utility, bean counting, and so on and so forth. But in fact, society at large isn't necessarily going in that direction. I mean, we've seen over the last few years, people keep telling us that bookstores and libraries are dying, but in fact, there's more book clubs than ever. Books keep selling in the millions. There's philosophy clubs everywhere. There is huge investments in museums, in concert halls, and so on and so forth. People want that kind of experience. People want that sort of additional component to their lives, because that's one of the ways people get meaning out of their lives. Meaning doesn't come out of just doing your job 8 hours a day and going back home and watching TV.
So let me just be clear on this, on where you stand on this, because this is very interesting. So this was indeed the last part of my essay, and what I said was that, what troubles me the most about all of this, at one level I understand it. We've been pushed into a defensive posture. Right. We're watching our disciplines being erased out of the university, and I have to tell you, much worse than philosophy, foreign language has completely collapsed at my university. I don't know how it is at CUNY.
That's right.
But at my university, it's completely collapsed to where I don't know what they're going to have all those professors teach. They may attrition them. I don't know what they're going to do. so we get put into this defensive posture, and so we look around. Okay, how can we defend this? How can we justify this? It's necessary for basic skills because we're still in the gen ed curriculum, and we can make our stand there. And so we make our stand there,
Right.
And that's to suggest that the value of these subjects is not just instrumental, but hyper instrumental. I mean, there's nothing more instrumental than a basic skill, right?
Right.
And what it seems to me is that the real value, and then here this is where we might not disagree a little bit, the real value in the sense of its greatest, deepest value, and the value of its greatest its greatest instances, right? So the greatest works of literature, the greatest works of philosophy, the greatest works of fine arts, that their value is primarily gratuitous, right? In the sense that it's not an instrumental value. It's a value simply in that it, as you said, enriches. I like to use the word sacralize, which I know you don't like because you think it has too many religious connotations.
That's okay.
But I think meaning is a good happy medium,
Right.
And I think that everybody feels the need for their lives to be significant in some way beyond simply achieving certain outcomes and ends.
That's right.
And so what I almost wonder is, are we making such a heavy case for the instrumental value of these things that we're denying what's really most important and best about them? And we're not then taking on a fight that we need to be taking on, which is that our society doesn't value such things anymore. And maybe, in other words, I'm almost thinking that we're fighting the wrong fight in the wrong place on the wrong grounds.
Okay,
Right.
so let me completely agree with you on one aspect and then challenge you on another one. So I completely agree that the most important value of the humanities is intrinsic. It's not external. It's not instrumental, right? I don't think that that it's a good idea in general, or it's in fact even a reflection of reality to sort of therefore downplay or deny the importance of the practical value. I think the two can live next to each other. I mean, I think that something can be both transcendental and practical at the same time.
You don't think that one drives out the other? You don't think
No.
that the obsession with instrumental values makes it harder to see intrinsic values?
But if you're using the word obsession, I would agree. But obsession implies that there is an imbalance, right? That there is, and you may be right that there is at the moment, for practical reasons, ironically, right, for reasons of survival within the university, there is in fact an imbalance. There is too much emphasis on the practical aspect and too little on the sort of transcendental, intrinsic aspect. But I don't think that those are necessarily at odds with each other.
Okay, go on.
A functioning human being needs both. You need techne and you need also the
Right.
basic stuff. But on that, I agree with you. Where I disagree is that this is a reflection of our society. I think this is a reflection of certain forces that have become dominant in our society that have, as I said, pushed the university in a corporate direction. But this is like saying that because half of the wealth in the United States is owned by 1% of the population, then the 1% of the population really is what it is all about. It's not. We have a very skewed perspective of things because certain forces seem to be inevitable and certain forces seem to be shaping things, and therefore sort of convince us that this is really what society, quote unquote, wants. As I said earlier, there's a number of instances, a number of examples that one can bring up that's not what society wants.
Right. No, you all the things you said is true. The book clubs, the popularity of these things, people going to Socratic cafes and all sorts of stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't believe in it. So think about Michael Sandel, for instance, our colleague at Harvard, who has become a pop star of philosophy, right?
Yeah.
So the guy fills up stadiums, both in the United States. This has just happened in Boston recently, and in Southeast Asia. The guy sells millions and millions of copies of his books.
I didn't know that. I didn't know he was that popular.
He's that popular. So the thing is, so how do you account for that? I mean, that seems to me an indication of a deep need for transcendental experience, for deep meaning and all that sort of stuff.
So you don't think that we devalue this?
I don't think so at all.
Then why is it so devalued in the university? I actually had a provost ridicule philosophy.
Yeah.
He's an engineer,
Yeah.
and said something about I could think about the meaning of life at home. He said this at a Senate meeting or something. I was appalled.
Right.
Why is there such a? I mean, it sounds to me like you're saying that this is a particularly toxic feature of the contemporary university.
That's right. And it's a particularly toxic fissure, by the way. You pointed out this earlier in the beginning, and maybe I don't want that to slip as a point. I mean, you made a distinction very, very early on between public universities and sort of elite universities, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't see this kind of behavior, or certainly not as much of this kind of behavior at elite universities. You don't go, I don't think your provost would survive a minute at Harvard.
No, of course.
At places like that, right? So that's an interesting question. Well, why? And I think the answer is, I'm speculating here, so bear with me for a second, but I think the answer is that over the last 20 or so years, we have seen a deliberate assault on public education by certain political forces. That assault has taken the shape of, first of all, ridiculing the humanities in particular, precisely because the humanities are dangerous, my friend. Yeah. That's the thing. Why is it that so many right-wing politicians are against the teaching of philosophy?
Yeah, Mark Rubio just said that you'd be better off being a welder.
Exactly. I don't think that's by chance, my friend. That's where where is it that you're going to read Marx? In philosophy courses. Where is it that you're going to be reading Nietzsche? Or where is it you're going to be reading, counterculture novels or novels about colonialism or racism or feminism? In humanities departments, you're not going to read them in engineer courses.
Right.
So there's that. That has caused, of course, that's been one of the causes, but it has resulted in a steady decrease of state funding for state universities, so much so that some universities are barely recognizable as state universities because they get less than 50% of the funding from their states, which means that the students are actually now increasingly paying almost the level of tuition.
Right, so at the really good ones like Michigan now, it's practically private school tuition because probably they have a bigger endowment than a state.
Right.
But in my state, it's almost all, it's state and tuition, that's it. We don't have an endowment of any sort of significant size, yeah.
So, but University of Virginia is the same thing. And
yeah.
Even CUNY, where I am, which is still one of the most affordable schools, public schools in the country, our public funding keeps going down and down and down. And of course, how do we make it up? Some of our colleges do have small endowments, but mostly it's about tuition, which means that essentially that concerted effort over the last several decades has resulted in essentially the privatization of public universities. Of
the good ones, and then the ones that don't are subject, you're saying, to the pressures of the state legislators,
right,
who want STEM and want practical, and that's where all this outcomes-based assessment comes and all this sort of stuff that...
Add to that we now have a corporate culture of administrators. It used to be that even even high-level administrators were actually faculty who would serve as a dean or as a provost, sometimes as a president for a number of years, and then they will go back to the rank of faculty. That was an organic way of running a university because, of course, these were your colleagues. And they will, you now are for a few years making decisions about how to distribute money and resources to your colleagues, but in a few years down the road, you're going to be one of them again. So you're going to have to be careful about how you do that. You are playing for the same team in some sense. But now we have a cadre of university administrators who are completely independent. Some of them don't even have a history as faculty. They come from, especially presidents.
Our president is a former lawyer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They come from the outside. They have a completely different mindset. They really don't care or don't know about how education works, and they make decisions based essentially on a corporate model. And this is what is destroying public universities. This combination of forces of increasingly reduced funding on the one hand and sort of corporatization on the other hand, that is what we need to resist, however, I would suggest. And that is one of the reasons why the humanities are in so much trouble. I don't think it's a reflection of society at large. I don't think that is what society wants. I think this is the result of a very concerted political effort and of a very small number of people who are very influential within the university these days, who have changed the way or are changing the way in which universities work.
Certainly public ones.
Correct.
And the public ones that aren't Michigan or Virginia, especially.
Exactly.
I'll have to think about that. That's a very interesting suggestion because you're certainly right about there seems to be all sorts of enthusiasm in the popular culture for a number of these sorts of things. I did not know that Sandel was filling stadiums. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I did not know that. But the other point is well taken. I have to think about that. That's a good observation. So I think that we covered this pretty well.
I think so. Thought for
And we got to disagree enough that people will maybe be a little more satisfied. What's usually a chorus. Um, and listen, you have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
You too.
And I hope to see you over Christmas break. I will be coming to New York. I hope we can work it out.
Absolutely. Let me know.
All right, Massimo. Take care and good grading finals.
Thank you. Have a good one.
All right. Signing off now.